If the most important empirical question in the history of the world is, did Jesus Christ rise again from the dead? And I would suggest to you that it's probably certainly one of the top questions which we need to know an answer to from an empirical point of view, from a practical, real-life, experiential point of view. Because if the answer to that question is yes, he did, then the implication and the ramifications are just so vast that they would carry and reverberate down through the entire chambers of recorded human history, even to the present day. So Easter is probably one of those times in history, maybe the most important time in history, where we need some answers to some questions. And there are quite a few questions that the whole story, in fact the 4 stories of the Gospels, presents to us. We need to look at them, I think, in some detail and some care. But one of the things which strikes me as most difficult of all, I suppose out of all the characters which are present within that Easter story of crucifixion and resurrection and betrayal, the most complex character, I would say, for me to understand, is Judas. Judas is someone I can't really get inside the head of and try to understand his motivations. It's not very clear to me why he did what he did, and why his name is now synonymous with the greatest betrayal of all time. Judas, why did he betray Jesus? What was his motivation? What was it that spurred him on to do that? We're told in all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, that Judas was the one who betrayed Jesus to his enemies. And from that time, as I say, Dante in his circles of hell has reserved the deepest circle of hell, the most agonizing and appalling circle of hell, for those who betray another. And that's the greatest sin as far as Dante was concerned. And of course, Judas is at the very center of that circle of hell. There seems to be no greater crime that can have been committed than the one that Judas did, not according to Dante at least. But why? Why did he do it? Well, if we look at it superficially from the accounts of the Gospels, we're told time and again that Judas was a thief, that he looked after the money for the disciples as they went around, and he used to help himself to the money which they kept in common as he looked after it, and no one could track it as easily as he, so he spent money on himself. But that doesn't really cut it. That's not sufficient. It's not sufficient to explain why he betrayed Jesus at this time and in this place and in this manner. If he'd been a thief, fair enough, he may well have been a thief. That was the judgment of the other disciples. But that doesn't explain why he betrayed Jesus at this point. Why not earlier on? Why not later on? What is it about this particular time that caused Judas to feel a particular desire to betray Jesus at this point in history? And also, how do we understand the character of a man who would, at the beginning of a week, be happy to betray the one who he idolized the most and looked up to the most and followed, and at the end of the week feel so much remorse for that act that he went out and hung himself? There's a paradox here between the beginning of the week Judas and the end of the week Judas. What is it that can explain that kind of thing? And I think if we want to get to the heart of this, we have to look more deeply into the events that took place at that point. And I think there may be one event which possibly has been overlooked by many people, which may be the spark or the genesis of the whole reason why Judas felt this painful animosity and anger which welled up within him, which sent him out in order to betray his Lord and Master. I will take you back to the time of the resurrection of Lazarus. It happened about a week before Jesus' eventual death himself, before his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And when he brought forth Lazarus from the tomb, it was only a day or so after that there was a special feast held in Jesus' honour in the house of Mary, Martha and Lazarus. And during that feast, Mary took the alabaster jar of precious ointment, perfume, which apparently was so costly as to be worth a year's wages. And she broke it and anointed Jesus with it and poured it on his feet and wiped his feet with her hair. Judas's response at this point was to say, "Why did you do that?" There may be a touch of jealousy in those remarks, but that money could have been spent and given to the poor, though by all consent that was just high holy talk, virtue signalling on his part. The idea that he didn't really care much for the poor, but he would have had the money for himself because he helped himself to the purse. But notice this is the important thing. What was Jesus' response to that kind of high moral ground talking and telling everyone off for spending such money and telling the girl off for that? Jesus rebuked him, and rebuked him very publicly, and put him down and put him into his place. "Don't speak like that to her," he said. "What she's doing is a good thing. You'll have the poor with you always. You won't always have me." And we get a flavour here of a public dressing down. The idea that in front of all the other disciples, Mary, Martha and Lazarus, Jesus told off Judas in the most public and demeaning kind of way, put him in his place. One can easily imagine the natural reaction to that is a resentment that builds up into an anger and a feeling of, "I want my own back. I'm going to get my own back, just you wait and see, Jesus." And that, I would say, would explain the sudden burst of enmity and animosity against Jesus, and which might have been the spark which led to his betrayal. And so, fueled by resentment, bitterness, and anger, we're told that Judas went out, and then, after the triumphal entry, by the look of it, made his way to the house of the chief priests and the Jews, declared himself to be one of the disciples, and offered to provide them with an opportunity for arresting and taking Jesus. Why was that such a good offer? Why was that worth having? Well, they had tried to arrest Jesus on numerous occasions previously and always failed. He'd always slipped into the crowd. He'd always been able to evade them, presumably because there was a great crowd around him. But here, Judas was offering to find an opportunity when that crowd wouldn't be there, when things would be quiet and silent, when there would be the least possibility of resistance, and they would be able to definitively and finally take him. The fact that that didn't take place for a number of days, right up until the wire, really, right up until the day before the Passover feast, which they were keen to make sure happened before then, that they got Jesus out of the way before that event. But it took until that very late occasion on Thursday night when Judas finally returned back to the chief priests and said, "The time is now." He was prompted in that, of course, by Jesus himself. And that's also another interesting question for us to look at in another time. Why did Jesus prompt Judas And how did Judas know that Jesus already knew? There was lots of issues involved in the psychology between these two people. What was really going on? But as far as the motivation was concerned, that really happened back at Bethany. Jealousy and resentment and anger, coupled with a grasping need for trying to turn that eventuality into money, which is what he did. It's similar to the experience of Cain and Abel, where Cain was jealous of his brother Abel because he had all the plaudits and all the respect. It's similar to the case of Joseph and his brothers in Genesis, where Joseph in his coat of many colours attracted the attention and the jealousy of all the brothers too. Jealousy is a primary force here, and being humiliated publicly was the impetus and the spring which caused this ultimate betrayal, and one which not only led to the crucifixion of Jesus, but also to the destruction of the one who did the betrayal as well.